Hello and welcome back. Today we are going to be continuing our lecture series on industrialization. Specifically today, we're going to be discussing big businessmen, and are they titans of industry, meaning good guys, or are they robber barons, which means the bad guys that are manipulating workers? In reality, the answer to this question is yes, they're both. We a lot of times I think one of the things that we do really bad in history is when we're discussing either groups of people or individuals, we like to put them in nice, clean categories. They're either the good guys or the bad guys. When in reality, they're human. And so, and that means that parts of them are good and parts of them are bad. They're going to do some good things and some bad things. If you group people, based on, the business owners versus the workers, that holds true. Each side will do good things and bad things. When you group it in the terms of, different economic theories or ethnic groups or whatever. The truth is that when you talk about groups in terms of good or bad, you're oversimplifying a very complex issue. When you're talking about a person being good or bad, there are very few purely good people out there. There are very few purely bad people out there. Now, there are some really bad people out there, but those are generally the exception to the rule. So when we're talking about these guys, these big businessmen, business leaders, factory owners, and asking, are they good or bad? The reality is they're a little bit of both. They're going to do some good things. They're going to create jobs. They're going to create wealth. They're going to invent new products and make them inexpensive so the average person can get them. They're also going to do some bad things. They're going to create monopolies in some cases and gouge up prices. They're going to, in some cases, mistreat their workers, make them work long hours for low pay and unsafe conditions, use child labor. And so does the good outweigh the bad? Well, that's for you to decide, right? It takes a smarter man than I to figure that out. And really, honestly, depends on which individual you're talking about. So let's talk about them in general, and then you make the decision. So, first of all, when we're talking about these big businessmen, we got to understand that a lot of them believed they were superior to the average person. And that's because the science of the time was essentially telling them that. Another thing that we do really bad in history and in science is we like to pretend that, our current version of what the truth is the final and total truth. And so we like to pretend that science doesn't change and science theories don't change. And that's wrong. Because in the mid 1800s, early 1900s, the science of the time is people are taking the scientific theory of Darwinism, of evolution, and that things evolve over time, and those who change and adapt are the most fit, and they're the ones that are going to survive. Well, Herbert Spencer, a guy that's deeply involved in like what we would refer to today as sociology, is going to apply that concept of survival of the fittest to human beings and come up with an idea called social Darwinism, which means that the most fit people, the people that have evolved the most over time, are going to be the ones that rise to the top of society. And so that means the smartest, hardest working, most talented people will take over. And so, the rich in particular, but pretty much everybody, scientists are promoting this idea as fact. And what that's used for is to justify these gigantic fortunes, and these super rich businessmen are going to say, you know what? I have figured out the system. I'm more evolved than everybody else, and the cream rises to the top. And so I don't have to pay my workers a lot, because if they're good, if they're evolved, they'll be able to work their way out of that mess and they'll become just like me. And it becomes a justification, not just for these gigantic fortunes that these businessmen have, but it's also a justification for not having to help the poor. that, look, if they're evolved enough, then they'll figure out a way to get out of poverty. And if not, then they're not going to be successful. And just like other species, the least fit die off, the strong survive, and society is better for that. And so you can see how this takes a really dark turn, because it can be used to justify for not helping the poor, and not just not helping the poor, but almost promoting this idea that if they die off, that's a good thing for for society in general. Eventually, guys like Adolf Hitler are going to get their hands on social Darwinism, and they're going to really run with it, and they're going to take it a step further and say, you know what, we can speed along evolution by just killing off the people at the bottom. And anytime we think about this, we're going to start to create racial hierarchies, and that's what happens with social Darwinism. If it holds true for animals, and then it holds true for individual people, then that suggests then that it can also be applied to ethnic groups. And so, people are going to use this to say, well, we can group ethnic groups in a racial hierarchy. And I'm here to tell you, as somebody, that studies history, anytime society say it is good to group people based on racial lines, bad things happen. That's just what it is. And it doesn't matter if the intention is good or evil, right? Hitler thought he was doing the world good by eradicating, certain racial groups because of concepts like social Darwinism. And so, grouping people like this by their ethnicity and then ranking them for whatever reason, that historically works out very bad. And so when societies embrace this concept, generally speaking, very bad things happen. And so social Darwinism is science, essentially promoting racial hierarchies and socioeconomic hierarchies as well. And so this is a kind of a terrible thing. Today, scientists recognize that this is not how evolution works. Just because you made yourself rich doesn't mean you're more evolved than other people. There's lots of different things that play into that. And just because one ethnic group happens to be on top doesn't mean that at that particular time in history doesn't mean that they are more evolved than other groups. It doesn't work like that. Every ethnic group has been on the top of a world society at one point or another throughout history. There's just so many different things that play into why certain groups are at the top of the socioeconomic status, and race is just not the primary factor for that throughout history. There's so many other things that go into it. Although sometimes when systems are flawed, that can be a factor, but it's the idea that race, ethnicity, socioeconomic class somehow means you're more evolved than others. That's been essentially rejected. But the people at the top of the economic system all around the world, and including America, they believe in this concept, which is what's going to allow them to justify their gigantic fortunes and going to justify the low pay, long hours, and unsafe conditions of their workers, because they're just not evolved enough to get themselves out of that set of circumstances. So now we're going to talk about some of these actual businessmen that create these gigantic fortunes, and a little bit of what they do. Cornelius Vanderbilt is going to be one of the first major titans of industry. He's going to get his start in the shipping industry, and so he's going to run like actual ships transporting people and goods on the northeast coast. And he's going to take a huge risk. He gets the nickname Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt from his days in actual ships. He's going to take a huge risk, and he looks around, and this is one of the things that capitalism is good for. It allows individuals the free choice of what they want to do with their life, and if you're willing to take a risk, you can build this great fortune. And Vanderbilt, looks around. He owns a few ships. He's doing really well for himself, and he looks around and he sees that the future is going to be in railroads. And so what he does is he takes this gigantic risk and sells off all of his ships and his shipping empire, which is worth quite a bit of money, and then invests in this brand new industry, unproven industry of railroads, and is going to start to build a railroad empire, and he's going to start to consolidate a real railroad empire. Now, he doesn't have a monopoly over railroads. He'll have a monopoly in regions of the country, but not in the whole country. But he builds this first super empire in railroads, and is going to essentially build up this fortune of over $100 million, roughly around $105 million. He's going to make travel safer, more efficient. He's going to be able to provide these services that is going to allow the economy to grow and cities to trade with each other, and that's going to create all kinds of jobs all throughout this country. And it's really going to spur on the economy, and that's a good thing. But he's going to be shady in how he does it. And as a matter of fact, as he's consolidating his empire, he wants to be able to buy one of the major railroads, the major railroad that supplies New York City. He doesn't own that one yet, and the owners won't sell. And so he very ruthlessly takes over the railroad. He doesn't own that railroad, but he does own the bridge that the railroad has to go over to supply New York City with goods and food. New York City is not self-sufficient. They've got to ship in food from the countryside, and they got to use railroads to do it. And so Vanderbilt comes up with this just absolutely diabolical plan to be able to buy the railroad that he wants cheap, even though the owner doesn't want to sell. And what he does is he closes down the bridge that the railroad uses to supply New York. And when that happens, he essentially takes New York City hostage. I mean, he's cutting off the supply of food to New York City because he's mad at a railroad for not wanting to sell to him. Well, that railroad, stock prices plummet on that railroad. It's when you buy stock, what you're buying is a share of the company. Well, if the company doesn't do well, everybody sells their shares before the price gets too low. Well, Vanderbilt knows that. And so the entire country, everybody who owns stock in this railroad starts selling it super cheap. And when they start selling it super cheap, guess who buys it? That's right. Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt buys it dirt cheap. This will actually cause a recession in the American economy. So that's like the entire economy is going to see a downturn because of what's happening in New York City. New York City is that important to the economy. Well, once the stock prices plummet, Vanderbilt buys up all the stock, and then guess what he does with the bridge? That's right. He opens it back up. Stock prices for that railroad soar again. We're going to see the economy recover, and Vanderbilt is going to come out the winner here. And so, think about that. To build his fortune, he took a city hostage, essentially plummeted the entire American economy, and not the entire American economy, but vast portions of it, just so he could buy this railroad. Shady. But then once he's amassed this fortune, he's going to start to become a philanthropist, which is just somebody who does charity work. A rich person who spends their fortune in charity work is called a philanthropist. And so, Vanderbilt is going to start to fund education. He recognizes that the best way to get talented poor people out of poverty is through education. And he's going to donate literally millions of dollars, to university systems. That's how Vanderbilt University today gets their name, is because this guy helped fund it. And so he's going to do, he believes that in American individualism, in this ability of for people to pick themselves up from their bootstraps. He also recognizes that certain people, it's harder for some people than others. And so people at the top he believes should help the people at the bottom that need that extra help by doing charity work. And one of the best ways to do that is through education. And so he's going to donate significant portions of his money back to society, back into education to help people, essentially help themselves out of poverty. His fortune is going to be worth about $105 million. Next guy we're going to talk about is John D. Rockefeller. John D. Rockefeller is going to really create America's first great monopoly. Great monopoly. This guy's monopoly is going to be gigantic. John D. Rockefeller, another one of these guys like Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt started small, bought one ship, and then built on it through hard work and intelligence and some luck. Rockefeller starts out middle class, always looking for the next idea to help to catapult him into a wealthy lifestyle. And he sees a growth in the oil industry. And when he's looking around and he's seeing oil mines, oil wells being built, he recognized that's really risky because you got to pay all this money to have a hole drilled in the ground. You might hit oil, you might not. If you hit oil, a lot of it gets wasted if in the spill off that happens when you initially tap a well, and sometimes you find nothing and you lose all the money that you invested in digging the well, or the well just doesn't have a lot of oil. It's super risky, and he doesn't want to get involved in that. But he recognizes the need for oil, primarily for kerosene. We haven't got to gasoline yet. And so he sees the need for it, and he recognizes the way to really get rich in oil isn't to drill for oil, because that is way too risky. It's to be the one that refines oil. And so he's going to create the Standard Oil Company. Now, there's lots of companies that refine oil out there, but what the Standard Oil Company is going to do, it's going to standardize the formula for creating kerosene. And so by standardizing it, he's going to make it safe. Back in the day before Rockefeller, if you bought kerosene, you didn't really know what you were getting. Sometimes this stuff you would light it on fire, it'd be just explode on you and blow up your house. And so, a lot of people were afraid to use it because if you got a bad batch, it could kill you and your family and burn down your house or your farm. And what Standard Oil does is it makes sure that every single batch of kerosene is the exact same and it's safe. And so people flock to buy it. And so he's doing well, and he's making some money. And early in his career, he recognizes that if he's going to be able to build a successful business, he's got to be able to get his Standard Oil all across the country. And so he actually goes to Vanderbilt, who's got this massive railroad business, and he goes to Vanderbilt and he works out a deal. He essentially says, look, you're always looking for new business, and you need people shipping their goods on your trains. Well, I have a lot of oil that I want to ship all across the country. And he actually lies and says he has more oil than he does. And he says, I can guarantee you that I can fill your trains with my oil. Like no other business can. But if you want me to do that, you've got to give me a discount. And the discount will allow him to supply his oil and to sell his oil cheaper, his kerosene, cheaper than everybody else's kerosene in the country, which means it's safe and it's the cheapest available. Guess which kerosene everybody's going to buy? His, right? And so he gets this deal and he starts making big bucks, man, big bucks. And then what he decides to do with that money is what capitalism kind of encourages people to do. It's to reinvest it back into his business. And he starts buying up other refineries. And once he does that, he's going to get to the point where he's going to control the vast majority of refineries in the country. And so once he does that, he's got a monopoly. And then he can use his monopoly to destroy the other, kerosene businesses around the surviving ones, the 4 or 5% that he doesn't own. He can essentially run them out of business by, essentially telling the other railroads to raise the prices on shipping other people's oil, and the railroads are going to have to do it or he won't use their railroads. And so that's That's going to happen to Ida Tarbell's dad, and Ida Tarbell's going to be the one that brings down his monopoly eventually. And so, I mean, he absolutely ruthlessly crushes businesses. There's a railroad company out there run by a guy by the name of Thomas Scott that is going to try to get into the oil pipeline business. And when that happens, Rockefeller is going to crush Scott's railroad company and essentially going to cause massive strikes, and Scott's business is going to fail because Rockefeller just undercuts him and destroys his company. Scott will die shortly thereafter, which will create Andrew Carnegie's career. Andrew Carnegie's going to hate John D. Rockefeller for that because he loved Thomas Scott. So he kind of just brutally crushes his enemies to be able to create this gigantic monopoly that's going to stay in place for a very long time, essentially until Teddy Roosevelt's presidency and the use of antitrust laws to end his monopoly. And so, Rockefeller, again, just like with Vanderbilt did some good things. He also did some bad things. Rockefeller does some good things and some bad things too. He makes kerosene safe. So he's going to allow, particularly like in the countryside where you're on the farm working all day. Now all of a sudden you can light up your home at night and have some family time, and it's safe, and you don't got to worry about burning your house down. All of that ends up being good. Eventually, Rockefeller is going to be able to make gasoline cheap. I mean, can you imagine a world without, today, without gasoline? I know people complain about environmental stuff, and that's 100%, a problem that we have to deal with. But think about how much our economy and our lives revolve around gas. I mean, this guy's going to help make the, gasoline possible, which is going to just be a boon to our economy. But then he also uses his monopoly to crush small businesses. There's going to be all kinds of safety concerns at his factories. He's going to pay his workers, very low wages for long hours of work, and there's going to be some real serious issues there. He does integrate horizontally, which just means it's a monopoly. You can remember that from our previous lecture. So the horizontal, those are all oil refineries right there. So the classic historical example of monopolies is the Standard Oil Company monopoly. And then our next great big businessman, is going to be Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie, again, is another story of American individualism. Carnegie is an orphan and, gets a job very young in a telegraph office, and eventually gets a job on Thomas Scott's railroad, right? Remember Thomas Scott? This is the guy that was crushed by Rockefeller. And so as a kid, Carnegie's working for Thomas Scott. Thomas Scott recognizes really quickly that Andrew Carnegie is, extremely hardworking and extremely intelligent. And so Carnegie rises up the ranks of Thomas Scott's railroad until he becomes Thomas Scott's right-hand man. And so as Scott's building his railroad empire, he recognizes that, the key to becoming wealthy in the railroads is the crossing the Mississippi River. Right at the time, there's no wooden or iron bridge that can be built that is strong enough to hold the weight of a fully loaded railroad car, right? And so train. It doesn't exist. The Mississippi River is just too wide. And so Scott recognizes that this is a problem because the railroads are literally shipping goods all the way to the Mississippi River, like dropping them off in East St. Louis, putting the goods on a boat or a ferry, shipping them across the Mississippi River, which takes time. You got to pay people to do it, so it costs a ton of money, and then putting it back on a railroad in St. Louis and shipping it out further west. That takes time. And time is money, and you got to pay people to do all that work. And so if you can build a railroad that can hold a fully loaded train that can cross the Mississippi without stopping, you're going to cut down the time by days it takes to ship goods out, which means you can do it, faster, and people will pay for that. And you could do it cheaper because you don't have to pay the ferries in East St. Louis to ship the goods across in a boat. And so Scott goes to Carnegie and says, figure this out. You're smart. You can figure it out. And Carnegie sets to work on it. And he's reading about how to do it. And essentially everybody says he can't do it. Wood won't do it. Iron won't do it. Iron is too brittle. It's too strict and rigid. And so it doesn't bend at all. And so if you put enough pressure on iron, it snaps, right? You need a little bit of bending, right? When weight gets on it, it bends a little bit. And then when the weight's off, it snaps back. That's what you need. And there's a new process out there called the Bessemer process. And the Bessemer process takes iron and takes all the impurities out of it and creates steel. And steel is essentially just like iron, except it flexes a little bit, which means it's going to be more sturdy and you can put way more weight on it. Problem is, the Bessemer process, even though it's been around for a little bit, nobody has made anything larger than like forks out of steel. And so nobody's done anything great with it. There's no great steel mills that have been developed, right? I mean, you've got to be able to build a railroad out of steel, you're going to have giant steel mills, and nobody's done that. But Carnegie was given a task and he starts to do it. And he actually is going to take out his own money. He's going to borrow, he's going to use the money that he's made in the railroad industry. He's going to borrow money from all kinds of people. And he's going to essentially build his own steel works that's going to be large enough to build an entire bridge out of steel. That bridge will become the first steel bridge in human history, and it's going to be right in East St. Louis. It's still around today. It's called the Eads Bridge. It's designed by a guy by the name of Eads, and so Eads gets his name put on it. But this is completely untested. He's taking, again, because capitalism gives you the opportunity to take risks. And if you take risks and you're smart and it pays off, you can become fabulously wealthy because of it. And so he takes this risk. He builds this bridge right when the debt collectors are knocking on his door and it looks like it's all going to fall apart. He builds this bridge, and then nobody will use it because it's this new magic metal that nobody trusts, right? New technology, just because you create a new technology doesn't mean you can get rich by it, right? Today, look at like self-driving cars. That's a great technology, and you'd think that was a guaranteed thing to make you rich, but guess what? I'm not getting in a self-driving car. It's scary. I don't understand the technology. It seems like voodoo magic to me. And so I'll let you get in that car, but until that kind of technology has been around for 10 years and I see that people aren't dying, I'm not getting in it. And people feel the same way about Carnegie's Bridge. But Carnegie isn't just a good businessman, he's a good salesman. And he knows that there's this old wives' tale out there that an elephant won't walk across an unstable structure, right? That's not true. They will. But it's a wives' tale because, that we kind of know at the time period that elephants can sense vibrations through their feet, which is true. And so, that kind of parlays into, well, they won't stand on something unstable. So he hires an elephant and marches it across the Eads Bridge. When that happens, all of a sudden, people like the bridge, and they, it starts to get used, and it's gonna help Thomas Scott's career until Rockefeller kills it. But Carnegie learns a lesson, right? Particularly when Rockefeller kills Thomas Scott's railroad, Carnegie recognizes the future isn't in railroads, the future is in steel. And he gets out of the railroad business and gets in the steel business. And America is going to go crazy for steel. We're going to use it to build our railroads. We're going to use it to build we're going to rebuild our cities out of steel with skyscrapers. Because, before steel, you could only build buildings 4, 5, 6 stories tall. With steel, the sky's the limit. We're going to, use steel in our military to eventually build, ships and once we get past World War I, tanks and all that kind of stuff. And so the future is steel. And so Carnegie really is the American dream, because he will become, with the steel industry, will become the richest man in the world. He's going to surpass John D. Rockefeller, his great rival. He hates Rockefeller and he always wants to have more money than what Rockefeller does, so he can like rub it in his face that he defeated Rockefeller, the guy that took out his beloved mentor, Thomas Scott. And so his steel industry is going to become gigantic. Now, he also doesn't create a monopoly. He vertically integrates. And so there are other steel industries out there, but Rockefeller will always outproduce them because vertical integration is when you own every step in the process. If you remember that from a previous lecture. And so he's going to own the iron mines. He's going to own the railroads that move the iron around. He's going to own the steel mills, and he's going to own the distribution network of the steel. And so because he owns all that, he doesn't have a lot of overhead, or he doesn't have other businesses gouging prices for him. And so he can sell his steel cheaper than everybody else's. He's going to make just a dynastic fortune. And so, he's going to eventually, once he sells, and he will sell his, Carnegie Steel, he's going to sell to J.P. Morgan, an investment banker, who we're going to talk about here in a second, for $490 million, which would, is an unheard of amount of money back then. It's one of the greatest fortunes the world has ever seen. It's a massive, massive amount of money. So, he's vertically integrates and creates this vast steel empire. But what he's most known for is what he does with that money, right? He's got his steel industry. I mean, the Homestead strike. He is going to happen during his watch, where he's working in his steel mills are totally dangerous. The workers work long hours with extremely low wages. He makes cities safer because of steel. He makes, bridges safer and railroads safer because of steel, and all that's great, but his employees are really suffering. And so, the Homestead strike is going to end in this just violent, bloody mess. And so there's these bad things that Carnegie does too. But what he's most remembered for is his idea of the gospel of wealth. Once he's created this gigantic fortune, Carnegie believes it's his duty, it's his obligation to use that money to help the less fortunate. And so he creates this philosophy known as the gospel of wealth, where he says wealthy Americans have a responsibility to further social progress. And so what Carnegie does is he uses his money to build libraries all across the country, right? I grew up in Belleville, Illinois. The Belleville, Illinois Public Library was founded on Carnegie money. And so the reality is he recognizes that if poor people are going to be able to have a chance to work hard and get themselves out of poverty, they're going to need an education to do that. And back then, public schools, universities, and public libraries are the way to do that. And so he's going to fund all of those things. He's going to fund universities. He's going to fund the libraries. He's going to fund the arts, because it's not just about wealth and helping people move up the socioeconomic ladder. He's also going to fund the arts. He recognizes that life's not just about making money. Yeah, making money is great, and we need it for security, and it's important, but it's really the arts that are going to bring value to our life. And so he's going to fund arts, so the average person can go and enjoy time at an art museum, or at a performance of a symphony, or whatever. And so whatever it happens to be, Carnegie's going to help fund that and make it to where the average person is going to have access to that. Now, today, a lot of you are listening to that like, what average person wants to go to a museum or a symphony or whatever? Well, that's because you live in a world where you have TV and the internet and social media, and you have all of those things to escape from the harsh realities of life. Back in Carnegie's day, we didn't have those things. And so literally, the only entertainment we had were books and music and dance and art, like paintings. And so that's what people had, and he's going to really push for that. So he's not just creating a situation where low income people and poor people can get an education to make their lives economically better. He also promotes the arts to try and just make give you a distraction from just the everyday, that suffering that life is, and Carnegie's that's going to be Carnegie's legacy, and he's going to push other people to do it. He's going to say, build your gigantic fortune. That's fine, right? That's what you're supposed to do. Go be productive and invent a new product and create jobs and do all that. But once you have this fortune, you have an obligation to not just pass it down to your family. He's going to say that's ridiculous. Give them enough to be secure, sure. Help pay for their education, sure, but don't leave your entire fortune to your family. You need to be donating it to schools and universities and hospitals and the arts, which is what he does. He's going to support a death tax. He says, when I die, the government should then, tax my wealth and then use that money to build schools or bridges and roads that the average person can use. And he's really advocating that, the wealthy have an obligation to help out. Now, you got the right to build as big of a fortune as you want, because people won't, they're not going to invent new businesses or new technologies without the motivation of getting rich off of those things. And so you got to keep that motivation there. But then he's going to say, once you do that, you have a moral obligation to give back to the society that allowed you to do that. And so, charity work, that's the legacy. So, next guy we're going to talk about is JP Morgan. JP Morgan's different than the other guys. The other guys so far either picked themselves up from their bootstraps from poverty and created a gigantic fortune, or, Rockefeller's case, he was middle class and built this gigantic fortune. JP Morgan's not going to be that guy. His father is one of the wealthier bankers in America, and really is like kind of that old school banker, like don't take big risks, only invest with sure things. And, people who already have money keep the wealth within the sphere of the wealthy. JP Morgan's got different ideas. JP Morgan is more okay with risk. He wants to invest his bank's money in new technologies that are a little bit more risky, but have potential for bigger payoffs. And his dad always kind of stops him from doing that. Well, when his dad dies and JP Morgan takes over, and that the legacy of his bank is still around today, JP Morgan Chase. JP Morgan starts to invest in all these new industries. And think about, we've talked about some major industries within this series of lectures on industrialization, right? Edison Electric. Well, JP Morgan buys that and it becomes GE Electric, one of the biggest companies in American history. He's going to buy, US Steel. And so that's Carnegie Steel, essentially is he buys Carnegie Steel and turns it into U.S. Steel. And so, the guy's got his hands in a little bit of everything. So he's a major banker, an investment banker. He's the one that buys, Carnegie Steel and turns it into U.S. Steel, Edison Electric into GE, and is going to amass just insane amounts of money. As a matter of fact, he's going to create so much wealth and be, such a just legendary investor that at times when the stock market collapses, U.S. presidents will call J.P. Morgan and ask for help. And what he'll do is he'll take his vast reserves of cash and start buying stock to artificially lift the value of the stock market and stop stock market crashes. That's how much money he has. In reality, he is, up until the presidency of Teddy Roosevelt, JP Morgan is the most powerful man in America. And I mean most powerful. He's more powerful than American presidents. And so, single-handedly helps America get out of the Depression of 1895 by buying U.S. bonds to save the Treasury Department. it's crazy what he's going to do. And he does that because he wants financial stability. He doesn't like a market like this. He wants, he's not doing it just out of the kindness of his heart, because JP Morgan, unlike Carnegie and really Vanderbilt, JP Morgan is not this necessarily kind-hearted individual. He's all about stability and order, and the more stable the markets, the more predictable and the more safe his fortune is. And so, super wealthy guy that is going to help create some of these gigantic businesses. And then the last guy we're going to talk about is Henry Ford. So we got to fast forward to Henry Ford. Henry Ford is not a part of the Rockefeller, Carnegie, JP Morgan generation. He's going to come around after that. Ford is, we're talking, 1920s, kind of the era. So further on down the road, Henry Ford grows up on a farm, and he's smart, and he's constantly, this is him right here, he's constantly tinkering with engines, right? The combustion engine. And he realizes really quickly that he has the ability to build a car, that he can actually build automobiles, and he could do it cheap. Now, automobiles have already been around. Ford did not invent the automobile. And so he wants to build these cars because right now, all the cars out there are very, very expensive. They're designed to be expensive and luxury items and only for the rich. And Ford wants to change that. He believes that he can make a gigantic fortune by making cars cheap enough that the average family can afford one. But the problem is that there's a group of car manufacturers called ALAM, right? They own the patent on the automobile. And so he doesn't have the right to mass produce cars and sell them without permission of ALAM. And they're not going to give it. They want to make relatively few cars, sell them for an extreme amount of money, and that's how they want to make their profit. And they believe that if you make cars cheap, then rich people won't pay big money for the ALAM cars. And so they refuse Ford the right to make and sell cars. Well, Ford, being a smart guy, says, you know what? I can build cars better than you. And he challenges the ALAM monopoly. He challenges them in the sphere of public opinion. And he says, if your cars are so great, I challenge you to a race. And if my car beats your car, you're going to have to release your patent and allow me to build cars too. And ALM agrees. They can't say that their cars are the best and charge an arm and a leg if some farmer says that he can build a better car. And so they have this car race, and he wins. And when he wins, ALM could just say, we're still not going to release the patent. But monopolies by this point are so far out of favor that they recognize that the tide is against them, and they allow Ford to be able to build cars. And so he's going to go gangbusters, and he's going to start to there's this economic and business concept that is called Taylorism. And Taylorism is essentially the idea that you can scientifically study workers and use that information from the study to make them more efficient, right? If I'm working over here on a car and the tools are on the other side of the factory, and every time I need a new tool, I have to walk all the way over there and come back, that is, that's too time consuming. And so scientific management, or Taylorism, is really what the term is used back then, because a guy by the name of Taylor came up with it. It says, you know what? Let's keep the tools right behind the guy. And so all he has to do is turn around and come here, and we'll make the parts close. And, he'll take the assembly line and innovate that as well. And so instead of, me working on my part, walking it over to you, handing it to you, you work on your part and walking over. No, we'll put all the parts on a conveyor belt and have the part come to me, so I don't have to really leave. It's really kind of taking the individualism out away from the worker and making it as simple and quick as possible. Doing that means you can make things way faster than otherwise. And the faster you can make things, the more you can make of them. The more you can make of them, the less you can sell it for. The less you sell it for, the more people will buy it. The more people will buy it, the more money you make. And Ford is all about that. And so he'll take the process of building a car from 12 hours to an hour and a half. So he's going to pump out cars so fast that he's going to be able to sell them relatively cheap, and people are going to buy a whole bunch of his products. And he does that through division of labor and dividing up complicated tasks into a series of smaller tasks. And using standardized parts. As a matter of fact, he very famously said one of his first cars is called the Model T, and he very famously says, you can get a Model T in any color you want as long as that color is black. And the point is this, you don't get options. Because if you get options, if you did paint, for example, if you want a green car, red car, blue car, I got to buy green paint, red paint, blue paint. That's too expensive. I'm only going to buy one type of paint, black paint, because at the time that was the cheapest paint out there. The other paints were more expensive, so I'll buy black paint because it's cheap. And then because I'm buying a lot of it because it's the only color, I can go to the people who make paint and I can buy it in bulk, which will get me a discount. Same thing with tires and brake pads and all that other stuff. If they're all the same, right, you can make them cheaper or you can buy them in bulk and get a discount. And so he's gonna, because he's buying so much of one thing, when he goes to a company, he says, look, you're selling brake pads to the company down the road for $10 a piece. They're only buying 100 a month, right? I'm going to buy 1,000 a month, but I'm not going to pay $10 for them. I'm going to pay $3 for them. And you're going to make way more money off of me than you are off of the company down the road if you give me that discount. And the company will say, well, I can't do it for $3 because I buy them for $3. I'll do it for $4. And even though they're making less money on each brake pad, they're going to sell so much more of them to Ford. It's worth it to them to give that steep discount. And then Ford is going to take that even further, and he's going to say, okay, so I'm buying all these pads. I want you to ship it to me in a box that is this specific dimension. I want, with the box needs to contain 10 2x4s. Each 2x4 needs to have 5 nails in it. Those nails need to each be 4-inch nails, and cap it off on the top with a lid with 7, 3-inch screws. Well, why would he be that specific? Well, because he's going to take that box and all of that wood and those nails and those screws, and he's going to reuse them in his vehicles. And so it's a way for him to save costs. He'll literally pay somebody to just pull out all the nails so they make sure they stay straight. They're going to take those boards. They're going to use them as the floorboards or the runners on the car. And it's if they've got to ship the brakes in something anyway, what's it hurt the company to ship them in a standardized box like that if they get to make massive profits off the brake pad sales? And then Henry Ford's going to use those materials in his cars to save costs so he could sell that car even cheaper, which means more people can buy them, which is going to put an automobile in the reach of the middle class in America. And it's going to allow the average person to be able to afford a car that they wouldn't have been able to afford without him. So the other thing that he's going to innovate and he's really going to recognize is that if you want to build things, a quality product, quickly and inexpensively, you have to have the best workforce out there, right? You can't have people that are working on starvation wages that are working 12 hours a day. They're just not going to work hard for you. And so what he recognizes is if his workforce is happy, then they're going to work extremely hard to keep the job that's making them happy. So he wants to make his workers happy. And so he's going to standardize the 8-hour day. He says, no more 12-hour days. If you work for me, you're going to work 8 hours a day. That's it. I'm going to create a 5-day work week, Monday through Friday. I'll give you Saturday and Sundays off. Most other places, you're working 10 to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, and you only get Sundays off, which means you're spending half a day in church and the rest of the day you're doing laundry or getting the stuff done around the house they have to do. And you essentially have no time for leisure activities or or anything like that. And so if you get a job with Henry Ford, you get an 8-hour workday, which means you get your evenings off. 8 hours of work, that's work-life balance. That means you're working for 8 hours, you're sleeping for 8 hours, and you have 8 hours a day to do with whatever you want. That's balance, right? Instead of spending 12 hours working and 8 hours sleeping and just barely having enough time to eat and clean yourself and before you got to go to bed and repeat. And so Henry Ford is offering a work-life balance, but he's also offering money. He's going to pay a livable wage. He wants his own employees to make enough money to buy a car, to be able to buy their own product. That benefits everybody. And so he's going to pay $5 a day. Now, that doesn't seem a lot to us now, but it's twice as much as you would make in Carnegie Steel Mill or at Rockefeller's oil refinery. So if you're a good worker, who are you going to go work for? You're going to work for Carnegie? You're going to work for Rockefeller that you're literally not making enough to be able to pay your bills and feed your family, and you have to work 12 hours a day, 6 days a week to do it? Or are you going to go work for Ford, where you get an 8-hour work day, 2 days off a week, and you make twice as much money? Well, duh, you're going to go work for Ford. And so people just flood to Ford. And then when you get that job at Ford, they're only going to hire the best, right? So if you're, not a hard worker, don't have good references, they're not going to hire you. They're only going to hire the best. And once you get that job, when Ford asks you to work hard, are you gonna? Of course. Of course, because your life is so much better working for him than it would be working for a guy like Carnegie. And so you're really going to be motivated to work as hard as you can and to be as good as you can because you have a good working for Ford. And so Ford is the first guy to really figure this out, that the government doesn't necessarily have to regulate industry. That if you're really truly interested in, making the best product in the cheapest way possible, you have to have happy employees. And so you have to pay them well. Now, in an unregulated laissez-faire economy, there's just too many business owners that won't do that because they're greedy, right? And so Ford really sets the model that the government will later kind of follow to regulate those other business owners that are just too greedy to do something like this. So now, when we're talking about, robber barons or titans of industry, I would imagine a lot of you are thinking, well, some of these guys did some good things and some bad things. Some of them did some really bad things. Henry Ford seems to do lots of good things. Well, yeah, sure. But he's totally, to flip the script here, he is a total believer in social Darwinism. He believes in grouping people by race and then creating racial hierarchies. And so, there's some racism there, and definitely some racism there. But also, he is an early supporter of European fascism and the Nazi Party. He's a believer that he actually owns his own newspaper that he's going to use to spread propaganda about, a Jewish conspiracy to control the world. A lot of the early Adolf Hitler rhetoric, Henry Ford is going to believe in and help spread. He's a early supporter of Adolf Hitler. I say early because once it gets down to the killing of Jews, Ford is going to separate himself from that. That's taking it too far for him. But that shady stuff. So Ford, good guy or bad guy? Oh, well, he definitely did a lot of good things that we benefit from today, right? But the idea of in history how we just we like to paint people as either all good or all bad. That's just not reality. Ford did some really good stuff, but he also promoted an ideology that was not only just outright racist, but he also promoted an ideology, the ideology of Nazism and Right. So, good guy, bad guy, it's complicated. It's definitely complicated. So, are these guys robber barons or are they titans of industry? Well, the evidence for them being robber barons, did they hurt the United States? Well, they did, right? They destroyed small companies with their monopolies, right? They charged high prices if they had a monopoly. They exploited their workers with poor working conditions. You get hurt in one of their factories, you don't get unemployment, you don't get disability, you just get fired, right? I mean, that's terrible, particularly when the working conditions are bad because the employers just didn't make their factories safe. Long hours, low wages. That's bad. And then they used their money and power to buy influence with the political machines and to buy influence in Congress to keep the government from regulating child labor or minimum wages or things like that. All of that is bad. Now that doesn't apply to every one of these business owners clearly, but as a generalization, right? Those things happened, and the majority of these big businessmen did at least some, if not most, of those things. Now, are they titans of industry? Did they help the United States? Well, yes. They organized new industries, right? They Rockefeller made kerosene safe, and so all of a sudden now we get to have a nightlife. They made gasoline cheap, as well. Rockefeller did. Henry Ford made cars inexpensive and gave us an 8-hour workday and showed us that you can make a fortune treating your workers well. Carnegie Steel made bridges safer and allowed us to build skyscrapers, and so we can have low income housing in cities because of that. The philanthropy of the gospel of wealth is going to come from that. They're going to provide better services because they want you to buy their product. Their product has to be better than the other products. So we're constantly getting new things. We know that today, right? I mean, how old's your iPhone? Probably a year old. Why? Because they're always coming out with a newer, better version. Well, why do they do that? Because if they make things newer, better, people will spend their money, and that's how they make their fortune, and that makes our lives a little bit easier. Every time a new product gets invented, it's going to improve the quality of older products. We're going to get the beef industry in Chicago is going to allow us, after a lot of whole process here that we'll talk about later, is going to allow the average American to be able to afford beef because they've streamlined that product, and it's going to enrich the diets of people all around the country. We're going to see kerosene is another example of the increase in the quality of products as well, and if they organized vertically instead of horizontally, which most of these companies do, that means prices drop. So that, like I said before, there's two ways to help people in poverty, right? One is to increase their wages, right? But the way that probably helps the most is not just to increase their wages, but to drop prices. And so that means the money you already have and the money you're making can buy more, better stuff. And these businesses are going to allow that to happen, and so that's a good thing. And then all of the philanthropies that are created, all of the charities, Vanderbilt University, all the public libraries, and the Carnegie Center for the Arts, and all of that stuff as well. And so again, now, did all businessmen do these things? No, clearly not. Some of them, just were out to create a gigantic fortune for themselves, but the majority of them did at least some, if not most, of the things on this list, right? So, are they good guys or bad guys? Well, the answer is it's complicated. They're, just like everything else in life. It's probably a little bit of both, and some are more good than they're bad. Some are more bad than they're good. But it's definitely complicated. All right. So that is going to end our lecture for the day. Thank you very much for your time, and I will see you again shortly.